I was standing on my dock at sunrise when the Sachs 38th cabin went up on my island. Power tools screamed across the water, bouncing off the hills and cutting through the quiet I had spent my whole life protecting. Barges idled offshore. Fresh lumber was stacked in neat rows where my grandfather's trees used to stand. And at the edge of my shoreline stood Linda Harroway, clipboard tucked under her arm, not like a weapon, but like a prescription pad. She didn't look at my land with hunger. She looked at it with pity, the kind you reserve for something broken. She smiled warmly, shook her head just a little, and said, "Caleb, you've been carrying this place by yourself for too long. The community wants to help you." She gestured toward the mainland homes across the lake. "We're ready to bring this island up to code, so you don't have to shoulder this burden alone. The HOA has approved the final phase." That was the moment I realized she truly believed she was the hero of this story. What she either forgot or chose to ignore was simple. My island was never part of her HOA. Not now. Not ever. My family had owned it since 1926. I had the deed, the surveys, the boundaries carved into stone. I could have stopped it then. I could have made noise. I didn't. I let them finish every single cabin. Because noise is easy, silence takes discipline. And by the time court day came, they didn't realize they had been building evidence the entire time. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? I've never been someone who needed an audience. After years of noise, deadlines, and people telling me where to stand and when to move, quiet stopped feeling empty and started feeling earned. When my service ended, everyone assumed I'd settle down somewhere convenient. Close to town, close to people. Somewhere easy. I chose the opposite. My name is Caleb Monroe, and for most of my adult life, I worked as a Marine Corps engineer. I built things where mistakes cost lives and shortcuts got people hurt. When I finally walked away from that world, I didn't want rules taped to my door or neighbors measuring my life from across the fence. I wanted distance. Water. Space to think without anyone watching. That's how I ended up on Stonewake Point. The island sits just off the shore of Ashford Lake, near the small town of Ridgway Cove, Missouri. It isn't flashy. There's one old cabin with a stone hearth, a dock that's been repaired more times than I can count, solar panels angled toward the sun, rain barrels tucked behind the tree line, and trails worn in by decades of the same footsteps. No streetlights, no noise after dark. Just wind, water, and the sound of birds settling in at dusk. Stonewake wasn't a purchase. It was an inheritance. My grandfather, Walter Monroe, bought the island in the years after the war. He had seen what desperation and opportunity did to people, and he never trusted convenience. He used to say land was the only thing worth fighting over quietly, because the loud fights were the ones you usually lost. Walter was methodical, patient. He didn't just buy land, he studied it. He mapped boundaries himself. Kept records long after anyone else would have thrown them away. Deeds, surveys, amendments, handwritten notes folded into envelopes and tucked behind cabinets. He believed that if someone ever tried to take Stonewake, it wouldn't be with force. It would be with smiles and paperwork. He warned me about what he called shoreline vultures, people who hovered near water waiting for the land to become valuable enough to justify pressure. He said they never rushed. They waited for the moment when the owner was alone, tired, or isolated enough to be convinced they were doing them a favor. For years, Stonewake stayed invisible. Then the mainland changed. Across Ashford Lake, fields disappeared, roads appeared. What became Harbor Pines Estates rose fast. Oversized homes, manicured lawns, identical docks, and an HOA that believed order was the same thing as control. At first, they treated my island like scenery, something that made their views more valuable. Then the boats got bigger, louder, more frequent. Suddenly, Stonewake wasn't just a backdrop, it was an obstacle. A patch of land interrupting what could have been marketed as exclusive shoreline continuity. I didn't know that at the time. I just noticed the attention shift. That's when Linda Harroway came out to see me. The first visit felt harmless. She complimented the lake, asked how long my family had owned the island, commented on how peaceful it must be living out there alone. She spoke softly, thoughtfully, like someone conducting a wellness check rather than a negotiation. Then came the concern. She mentioned how my solar panels didn't quite match the visual character of the lakefront. She asked whether I'd ever considered improving the dock so it aligned better with community access standards. She dropped phrases like historical easements and shared stewardship, always followed by a reassuring smile. I corrected her politely. I told her the island wasn't part of Harbor Pines. There was no shared access, no community authority, no historical overlap. I assumed that would end it. Linda nodded the way people do when they hear something inconvenient but temporary. After that, the tone shifted. The next time I heard from her, it wasn't in person. It was a letter, official looking, courteous, full of language about cooperation and mutual benefit. It invited me to review documentation that suggested Stonewake fell within the HOA's extended oversight area. I responded once, calmly, with copies of my deed and surveys. Another letter arrived. Then another. They talked about compliance reviews, about helping me manage responsibility, about ensuring I wasn't exposed to liability by remaining outside modern standards. None of it was hostile. That was what made it unsettling. Every sentence was framed as assistance, as concern, as if resisting them meant I didn't understand what was best for my own land. I stopped replying. That silence didn't discourage Linda. It seemed to convince her that I just needed more help, more structure, more intervention. Looking back, that was the moment Stonewake stopped being my quiet retreat in her eyes and became a problem to be solved. And Linda Harroway had never been the kind of person to leave problems alone. The pressure didn't arrive gradually. It hit like a rising tide, invisible at first, then suddenly everywhere. Inspectors started appearing on my dock, clipboards in hand, notebooks full of violations that never existed. Evan Rourke, a young county inspector, arrived one gray morning and looked at me like he'd already lost the argument. Dock setback, septic permits, solar panels not approved for residential use. Every citation was technically written in the language of the law, but none of it made sense. When I asked who filed the complaints, he hesitated, then muttered quietly, "It's coming from the HOA." That word, coming, felt like a punch. Shortly after, deliveries began to fail. Mail arrived late, then sometimes not at all. Fuel for the generator refused, citing insurance restrictions. The marina refused to sell me gas or dock my small boat, claiming new policies that had never existed before. Even internet service was interrupted, flagged under some zoning review I hadn't been told about. It took only a few days for the pattern to become clear. This wasn't enforcement. It was isolation. They weren't trying to correct a mistake. They were trying to make living on the island difficult enough that I would yield. I went into town to investigate. At the courthouse, I met Diane Fletcher, a quiet records clerk who looked at me like she'd been waiting for someone like me. She asked few questions and handed me a stack of files. Every lakefront owner who had resisted Harbor Pines Estates HOA over the past few years, they ended up selling to the same buyer, Clearwater Development Group. I recognized the name immediately. "And who owns it?" I asked. Her gaze met mine. She tapped a line in the records. "Mark Harroway, Linda's husband." I felt the pieces click together like a trap snapping shut. All the visits, the polite suggestions, the helpful letters, they weren't attempts to enforce rules. They were designed to apply pressure, push me toward a sale I didn't want, all while lining the pockets of someone with a plan already in motion. This wasn't about community standards. It wasn't about protecting the lake. It was about land acquisition. For the first time, I realized I wasn't just being harassed. I was being herded. And the more I resisted, the more obvious it became. If I made the wrong move, I'd be just another casualty in a carefully executed scheme. From that moment, I knew watching silently wasn't just a choice. It was the only chance I had to see how deep this went and to plan how I would turn it against them. It happened without warning. I woke to the sound of engines deep across the water, low mechanical roars that didn't belong in the quiet I had built around myself. I stepped onto the dock just in time to see two construction barges pushing a floating platform loaded with heavy equipment toward the shoreline. Excavators, skid steers, generators, steel beams stacked in neat rows. They didn't just arrive, they landed, tracks cut into the sand, leaving deep impressions that would never disappear. Trees my grandfather had planted decades ago were marked with spray paint. Within minutes, one of the oldest cedars came down with a sound that made my chest tighten. A man approached. Rick Dalton, the foreman, mid-40s, sunburned, tired eyes that didn't betray his confusion but carried the weight of routine. He handed me a thick folder, permits, authorizations, emergency remediation orders, everything stamped and signed. They claimed soil contamination, urgent cleanup, temporary housing for environmental teams. Temporary. The structures going up were temporary. Cabins rose faster than any remediation project I had ever seen. Decks, footings, utility trenches, gravel paths, all laid with precision and speed. Renderings were pinned to wooden signs, future retreats for families, luxury accommodations marketed with photographs and descriptions. I could feel the urge to act, to stop it. My instinct screamed, call the sheriff, demand answers, confront someone, anyone. I called my attorney friend, Maya Reynolds. She listened quietly as I explained what was happening. Then she said something that made me pause. Caleb, unauthorized construction equals trespass. Willful trespass equals damages. And every structure they build increases their liability. Document everything. Her words should have been obvious. They weren't. For the first time, I made a decision that felt unnatural. I let them continue. I didn't interfere. I didn't protest. I watched. I documented every truck, every cut tree, every foundation poured. And yet, as the crews worked tirelessly, I felt the strain of restraint. Around the 10th cabin, I almost broke. My hand hovered over my phone, ready to call the sheriff when I saw them cutting down the oak my father had planted. The plastic creaked in my grip, and my heart raced. I remembered my grandfather's note. If they get greedy. Calling now would stop them, but it wouldn't punish them. I clenched my jaw, set the phone down, and watched the machines roar on. That night, standing alone on the dock as the sun set behind the barges, I realized something crucial. This wasn't just a legal fight. It was a trap. Every nail, every wall, every cabin rising on my land was a step closer to turning their own actions against them. For the first time, I wasn't just watching. I was waiting. And in waiting, I was winning. I didn't go looking for my grandfather's files because I wanted revenge. I went looking because I needed certainty. If I was going to sit still while my land was carved up, I needed to know exactly what he had prepared me for, and whether I was about to lose everything by trusting it. Walter Monroe never left important things in obvious places. He believed curiosity was earned. It took me most of an afternoon to remember the cedar cabinet he used to keep locked, the one he always said held paper that only matters when people forget who they are. Behind a false panel, wrapped in oilcloth and yellowed wax paper, I found an envelope thicker than it had any right to be. On the front, written in his steady hand, were 6 words that stopped me cold. If they ever get greedy, inside wasn't just paperwork. It was architecture. The first section laid out a layered truss structure so precise it felt like reading a blueprint. Ownership, control, and use were split apart deliberately. No single action could transfer the land without triggering consequences elsewhere. It was defensive design, the same logic I used overseas when a single weak joint could bring an entire structure down. Then I found the clause that made my breath slow instead of quicken. The land didn't revert to the county, it didn't revert to the state. Unauthorized commercial development triggered an immediate transfer to the Monroe Wilderness Trust, a private conservation trust my grandfather had funded decades earlier and then left dormant on purpose. Its charter was airtight. Stonewake Point was designated as a protected bird sanctuary and wetland preserve. No residential development. No commercial use. No retroactive approvals. The moment a permanent commercial structure was completed without consent, the land legally became untouchable. Every cabin they built wasn't just illegal. It was poison. Attached to that clause was the second blade, damages tied specifically to willful trespass. Not accidental encroachment, not confusion, but construction carried out after boundaries were established and ownership documented. Restoration costs. Environmental remediation. Loss of use. Disgorgement of profit. Every day they kept building, the numbers grew. I sat at the table long after dark, reading everything twice. My grandfather hadn't hoped this would work. He had planned for it. He understood that the most dangerous people don't steal outright. They convince themselves they're entitled. He built the trust so that the exact moment entitlement crossed into action, it would collapse under its own weight. The next morning, the island was louder than ever. Crews moved faster now, like they were racing something they couldn't name. That was when I noticed A.E. Rick Dalton watching them differently. He had stopped barking orders, stopped pushing timelines. Instead, he stood back more often, eyes tracking where equipment moved and where it shouldn't have been. One afternoon, I found him near a marsh inlet, staring at ruts cut deep into soft ground that should never have supported heavy machinery. "They told us this area was cleared," he said quietly. I didn't answer. A few days later, Rick showed up at my dock after the crews left. No vest. No clipboard. Just his phone in his hand and a look that said he already knew the answer to the question he was about to ask. "Was there ever contamination here?" he asked. I told him the truth. No fuel tanks, no spills, no emergency. The permits were built on a story that sounded responsible enough to move fast. Rick didn't get defensive, he went still. He told me he'd started taking photos weeks earlier, runoff pouring into the lake after rain, nesting areas crushed, dumping sites that weren't on any approved plan. He said he'd been in construction his whole life and knew the difference between cutting corners and being lied to. "They said we were saving the lake," he said. "We're wrecking it." From that point on, Rick didn't just document damage, he logged it. Timestamps, equipment IDs, internal messages that contradicted environmental safeguards. He saved instructions that told crews to ignore flagged areas if it slowed progress. He wasn't doing it for me, he said. He was doing it because he didn't want his name tied to what this had become. That was when I understood something important. The trap wasn't just legal anymore. It was moral. The HOA believed authority came from confidence and paperwork. They believed speed could outrun scrutiny. They believed if they sounded helpful long enough, no one would notice the damage underneath. But greed leaves more than documents behind. It leaves witnesses. As the cabins multiplied across Stonewake Point, so did the number of people who knew this wasn't rescue or restoration. It was exploitation wearing a clean uniform. And the longer they kept going, the harder it became for anyone involved to pretend they didn't see it. My grandfather had prepared for greed. What he couldn't have predicted, but understood all the same, was that greed always creates its own undoing. Linda Harroway didn't come back to the island after the crews arrived. She didn't need to. She went public. Within days, my quiet fight became a headline. The small-town newspaper ran a front-page story about a reclusive homeowner obstructing environmental restoration, painting me as the villain while portraying the HOA as the benevolent savior. The article quoted experts I'd never met, people with impressive titles, long lists of credentials, and conveniently vague claims about historic contamination and imminent environmental danger. Social media flared up. Community pages filled with calls to save the lake, and posts warning that I was standing in the way of public good. Comments accused me of greed, hoarding, and selfishness. Anonymous voices suggested the county should simply take over my land. At first, it was infuriating. But then I realized the PR campaign had an unintended effect. Attention brings scrutiny. That's when Dr. Emily Chen called. She was an independent environmental scientist, not associated with the HOA or Clearwater Development. She had read the articles and suspected the claims were manufactured. She asked to take independent water samples, and I agreed. Emily arrived quietly, without cameras or publicity. She collected samples from multiple points around the island and across the lake, then compared them to historical data going back decades. When she showed me the results, her voice was calm, but her expression was grave. There was no historic contamination. The only disturbances she could detect matched the timing of the construction crews, the recent soil displacement, sediment runoff, and improperly managed drainage. Simply put, the damage wasn't old. It was happening right now. Emily documented every detail. She prepared a formal report, which she circulated among colleagues, and word slowly reached the buyers who had already placed deposits on the cabins. They began asking questions about disclosures, permits, and environmental safeguards. A few questioned why construction had begun without proper testing. Agents representing the buyers started requesting documents that didn't exist. Linda panicked. Her carefully orchestrated timeline, built to pressure buyers into early commitments, started to unravel. Open houses were scheduled back-to-back. Sales incentives appeared suddenly, and every effort shifted toward locking people in before the truth could emerge. Her desperation was visible in the emails and messages Rick Dalton began saving, showing instructions to cut corners, speed up construction, and disregard flagged environmental concerns. Meanwhile, Linda doubled down publicly. She gave interviews claiming the project was necessary, that delays would hurt the lake, that critics were misinformed extremists. She framed her actions as protection for the environment and the community, speaking as if she were the moral authority. But every lie, every rushed sale, every corner cut became proof. By the time the county requested additional documentation, she was scrambling. Partial permits, outdated maps, insufficient compliance records. The longer she tried to control the narrative, the more evidence she created for what had actually happened. I never made a statement. I never responded to online attacks. I let her speak, let her build the story in public. Every claim she made contradicted a fact I had already recorded. Every assertion of good intent revealed the opposite. The PR campaign, designed to pressure me into compliance, had backfired spectacularly. What Linda believed would force me to surrender instead became the foundation for her own undoing. The louder she tried to control the story, the more visible the damage became, and every misstep she made was being documented for court. At the same time, Rick and Emily quietly compiled their evidence. Photographs, GPS logs, water samples, timestamps, messages from supervisors. Every day the construction continued, they strengthened the case. By the end of the week, the island was quiet only in appearance. Underneath, every log, every photo, every email was lining up, ready for the moment the law caught up with her. Her attempt to control the narrative through public attention had done exactly the opposite. She had turned the world's eyes on herself and given me the proof I needed to finally strike. Linda Harroway picked the day herself, confident and precise, like she always did. When the notice arrived that she was filing for emergency seizure of Stoneway Point to protect the lake and the community, it was clear she expected a triumph. Fast hearing. A judge she assumed would nod along. Public humiliation of me, the stubborn homeowner. By the time I arrived at the courthouse, the hallway was packed. HOA members in crisp clothes, a few reporters scribbling notes, cabin buyers clutching folders they didn't know they'd need. Linda stood near the front, smiling as though she owned every eye in the room. She barely looked at me. The courtroom settled. The judge entered. The case was presented as urgent, a matter of environmental protection. Linda's attorney spoke first, detailing contamination threats, uncooperative landowners, and the need for immediate action. It sounded practiced, polished, undeniable. Then my attorney, Maya Reynolds, walked in. Behind her, 3 individuals in dark suits silently took seats near the back. Observers, she explained, monitoring for federal jurisdiction and oversight. The air shifted immediately. Maya handed the judge a thick binder. "Your Honor," she said, "before any ruling, the court needs to review the trust documents governing this property." Linda's confident smile faltered slightly. The judge began reading aloud. Ownership, layered trusts, mineral rights, historical filings. Then came the reversion clause. Unauthorized development triggered an immediate transfer, not to the state, but to the Monroe Wilderness Trust, a private conservation trust my grandfather had established decades ago to maintain the land as a bird sanctuary and wetland preserve. The judge paused. "Has any written authorization been provided?" Linda's attorney jumped to answer, invoking implied consent and emergency powers. The judge cut him off. "No," he said firmly. "I'm asking for proof of authorization." Silence. Then the judge continued with the damages provisions: willful trespass, unauthorized construction, restoration costs, environmental remediation, loss of use, profit disgorgement. 7-figure calculations rang out in the courtroom, weighty and impossible to ignore. Next, witnesses testified. County officials under questioning admitted that inspection orders originated from the HOA, not independent environmental concerns. Emails, timelines, and documentation revealed a coordinated effort between the HOA, county offices, and Clearwater Development Group, owned by Linda's husband, Mark Harroway. Every step of the harassment, every denial of services, every rush to sell cabins had been orchestrated. The cabin buyers, seated in the courtroom, began whispering among themselves. One stood and asked aloud if this meant their properties had been illegally sold. Maya answered calmly, every cabin built without authorization was trespass. Ownership had never legally transferred. They had been sold something the seller had no right to sell. Linda finally rose. She tried to speak, claiming good faith, community protection, and environmental responsibility. Her voice was measured, sincere, almost apologetic. The judge stopped her mid-sentence. "You've spoken enough," he said. Then one of the observers stood. Calm, precise, federal investigator. They stated that the events under review extended beyond civil matters. Fraud, collusion, and environmental violations were now part of a broader federal investigation. The room went silent. The gavel came down. Construction was immediately halted. All assets tied to Clearwater Development were frozen pending investigation. Permits were suspended. County offices were directed to cooperate fully. Linda's plan, designed to humiliate me, had collapsed spectacularly. Every cabin she had rushed, every corner she had cut, every public statement she had made had built the case against her brick by brick. She had tried to control the story, but the story controlled her instead. By the end of the hearing, her confidence was gone. Her carefully curated narrative lay in ruins before the law, before the cabin buyers, and before every eye in that courtroom. For the first time since she stepped onto my dock with that soft smile and clipboard, I didn't feel tension. I felt quiet satisfaction. The tools, that had screamed across my island for weeks were silent. But this time, silence didn't mean surrender. It meant victory. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like a tide finally reaching its peak and then receding. The machines stopped. The barges pulled away. Equipment was left idle where it had been abandoned mid-task. The bright marketing signs disappeared overnight, as if someone hoped erasing them could erase what had happened. Clearwater development. Group I was the first to collapse, accounts frozen. Projects halted. Within weeks, the company formally dissolved under the pressure of federal investigation and civil claims. What had seemed like a polished, unstoppable development operation unraveled into a trail of shell companies, rushed filings, and financial shortcuts that didn't survive scrutiny. Harbor Pines Estates HOA followed soon after. Board members resigned one by one, some quietly, others under public pressure. Emergency meetings were called and then canceled. Residents who had once cheered Linda's promises now demanded explanations for how their community had become entangled in something so clearly exploitative. County offices weren't spared. Inspectors and officials tied to the complaints and citations were placed under review or resigned. The pattern of collusion, once invisible, was now exposed, and it didn't hold up under daylight. The families who had bought cabins were next. Retirees, young couples, parents securing a retreat for their children. They were collateral damage, victims of a scheme they hadn't asked to be part of. The court moved quickly to compensate them, recovering funds from frozen assets and redistributing them to buyers fairly. Though not everyone received exactly what they expected, none were left empty-handed. The cabins themselves were not demolished. Instead, the S. Monroe Wilderness Trust took control. Structures were stabilized, assessed, and repurposed as research housing for environmental scientists, conservation teams, and restoration crews. Decks overlooking the lake became observation points. Cleared areas were rehabilitated with native plants. Wetlands and nesting areas that had been damaged were restored carefully over months. Rick Dalton stayed. Once a foreman following orders, he became part of the restoration effort, offering insight into where the greatest harm had been done and helping implement long-term solutions. He was no longer a passive observer. He was actively repairing the damage caused by the very project he had once overseen. Diane Fletcher, the courthouse clerk who had quietly shown me the patterns behind the harassment, was promoted to oversee land records and development transparency. Policies were updated. HOA complaints tied to protected properties were flagged for independent review, and development near wetlands required third-party verification. Easement claims now had to be fully documented before enforcement could proceed. Stonewake Point began to heal. Water clarity improved. Birds returned. Wetlands regained their life. And slowly, the town began to feel different. Residents discussed what had happened openly, learning how easy it is for authority to be weaponized and how quickly greed can spiral when unchecked. For me, the dock returned to its original purpose: morning coffee. Watching loons glide across the water, evening light stretching across the lake. The island was no longer untouched, but it was honest. The damage had been mitigated, and the land was protected, just as my grandfather had intended. And in the quiet, I realized something profound. The battle had been won not with anger or confrontation, but with patience, documentation, and resolve. Stonewake Point belonged to the land again. And this time, it was safe. I'm back on my dock now, watching the sun rise over Stonewake Point just like I used to. The water stretches out calm and still, reflecting the morning light without interruption. No engines, no barges, no power tools screaming across the lake. Just birds calling, wind rustling through the trees, and the gentle lap of waves against the shore. People often ask me why I didn't act sooner. Why I didn't call the sheriff the moment the first machine touched my island. Why I didn't confront anyone, make noise, or fight back immediately. The truth is simple. Sometimes the strongest defense isn't resistance. It's patience. I didn't win by shouting louder than the HOA. I won by letting them prove exactly who they were. Every cabin, every corner cut, every carefully worded letter. Every act of greed became its own evidence, and by the time the law arrived, it was undeniable. My grandfather was right. Land doesn't defend itself. People do, not with anger, not with noise, but with restraint, records, and timing. The noise that once filled the island is gone, replaced by silence. A silence that carries weight, a silence that remembers, a silence that protects. The lake is healing. The town is healing. And I've learned something I'll never forget. You don't fight noise with noise. You fight it with silence. And if you wait long enough, the silence doesn't just win. It echoes. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?